Public hearing on the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties for its inquiry into the Convention on International Organisation of Marine Aids to Navigation. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders both past and present. I also extend any respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. In accordance with the Committee's resolution on the 4th of August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Reminder to all members of the media for the need of fair and accurate reporting of the proceedings of the Committee. As you can see, we have a number of members that have joined us today of the committee, and I might pause for a moment to allow them to briefly introduce themselves, starting with the member for Corangamite.
I'm Libby Coker. I'm the member for Corangamite, which is in Victoria, Great Ocean Road, and wraps around Geelong, Bellarine Peninsula.
Matt Burnell, federal member for Spence, Northern Suburbs of Adelaide.
And Senator David Fawcett for South Australia.
I'm Henry Pike, member for Clayman, which is on Brisbane Speyside.
Zanisha Mascaredos, member for Swan, south of Perth.
So a diverse range of members that are here, and I'm Lisa Chesters, the Chair and the Federal Member for Bendigo. I welcome representatives of the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts and the Maritime Safety Authority and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
I've got Paula Stagg, First Assistant Secretary of the Surface Transport Emissions and Policy Division within the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts.
Megan Scott, Assistant Secretary, Maritime and Shipping Branch from the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts.
Mary Dean, I'm General Counsel at the Australian Maritime Safety Authority.
And Amanda O'Brien, Treaties Manager, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of respective houses. The giving of false and misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. I'd now like to invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to members' questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to provide information on the Convention on the International Organisation for Maritime Aids to Navigation and for the expedited consideration of this treaty action. Australia is a current council member of the International Association of Marine Aids to Navigation and Lighthouse Authorities, which is more commonly referred to as IALA. As a member of this council, Australia has influence over the development of international standards for aids to navigation. These aids to navigation help vessels navigate safely in coastal waters and include things like lighthouses, radio beacons and buoys. Australia has 60,000 kilometres of coastline, including the Great Barrier Reef stretching for 2,300 kilometres. Given the large and unique coastline Australia manages and the number of ships that visit our waters every year, we have a strong interest in ensuring the standards for these aids to navigation are fit for our circumstances and that seafarers from around the world can use them both safely and effectively. Our maritime safety agencies, including the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, rely on the standards and guidance developed by IALA to ensure our aids to navigation support vessels navigating safely through our waters. The IALA Convention enables IALA to transition from a non-government organisation to an intergovernmental organisation. This will enhance transparency, strengthen governance and encourage international engagement. It will also allow IALA to expand its membership and open new avenues for funding and cooperation. Acceding to the Convention ensures Australia can continue in a leadership role on the IALA Council and help shape how international standards for aids to navigation are developed. My colleagues and I would be happy to take any questions from the committee.
Great, excellent. Okay, so no one else is making a comment? No, okay. Right, so I just wanted to say, just on expediting, we'll do our best to meet the deadline.
Thank you.
And the letter provided by the Minister, but we are running out of sitting days and sitting weeks.
Understood.
So just in relation to the treaty, I guess the first question is, why is it in our country's interest?
So, and I might hand to Ms Scott to go into further detail, but at the moment, so it doesn't fundamentally change the work that IALA does, but by going from a non-governmental organisation to an intergovernmental organisation, it generates greater governance, transparency, but it will also allow a number of countries that cannot currently work with IALA as a non-governmental organisation. They will be able to provide funding and partner and participate in IALA once it becomes an intergovernmental organisation.
That's correct, Ms Stagg. In addition, given the very significant coastline and waters that Australia manages and our very high standards that we already have, it is in Australia's best interest to remain in a leading role within this organisation. We championed the transition of the organisation from the beginning, and certainly AMSA's role within the Council for many years has been a leading place that we would like to remain. It plays in nicely as well with our work at the International Maritime Organisation and the increased focus we would like to have on the waters on this side of the country, the world, I should say.
So we've got a submission that came from Shipping Australia, who also raised their ongoing concern about how we work as a federation of states and the relationship between our states and the Commonwealth. Whilst your submission said the states and territories were consulted and raised no issues, do you have any concerns or thinking about how we implement, how we harmonise across the different jurisdictions, just in relation to the concerns that were raised by Shipping Australia?
So I will open, then I'll hand to Ms Dean for the answer technical elements. We did consult with states and territories. They have certain bodies of water that they are responsible for in terms of aids to navigation, and they do in fact follow the IALA standards already. We do know that there is an interface between Commonwealth and state jurisdictions. However, on aids to navigation, there is a significant amount of consistency that we don't see as a particular problem for us with regard to this convention.
Thank you, Ms Scott. That's correct. That is AMSA's position as well. AMSA manages and organises regular catch-up meetings with all of the states and territories where we discuss the aids to navigation standards and the work that's being undertaken at IALA. The states are invited to participate in that work if they have a particular interest that they would like to pursue. But as was indicated, the majority of the standards are being implemented consistently between both AMSA and the states and territories.
So given that it's pretty rudimentary, it's sort of steady as she goes, methodical, why the letter to expedite this treaty?
Certainly. So the agreement entered into force on the 22nd of August following the accession of the 30th country, which was Egypt, in May. So there was a 90-day period and then the agreement has entered into force. Then in December, the next step will be nominations for membership on the Interim Council of IALA. You have to notify, if you would like to be a member of that Interim Council, 30 days prior. So we would need to have exceeded by mid-November so we can then indicate that we wish to continue to serve on that Interim Council ahead of the general elections that would come in February next year.
So it was only referred to us on the 13th of August.
That's correct.
So if we were wanting to maintain that status, why wasn't it referred earlier?
Look, it's a good question. The department had, over the last 12 months, prioritised other treaties because we were seeking re-election this year to the International Maritime Organisations Council, which was a higher priority. And so the conventions we focused on up until a number of months ago had really been around those conventions that would be impactful for Australia's re-election bid to the IMO, because that's a really significant body, as is pointed out in a number of the submissions. Having acceded to those conventions, which helped shore up Australia's re-election to the Council, we've then turned our mind to some of these other conventions. It's always a little uncertain of exactly when they will enter into force because it's dependent on when other countries are acceding. But we are taking steps within the department to ensure we don't find ourselves in this situation going forward by having these come to J. Scott much sooner.
Okay. I'll just see if any of my colleagues have questions. Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, with the move to it being a intergovernmental body, is there anything on the agenda to look at moving from the bi-regional system of buoyage, which was an achievement in itself? It sort of brought it together from multiple systems to two. But as the recent accident in the US in Baltimore highlighted, shipping can cause massive disruption to economies if the navigation is not done well. And as a ship moves from one part of the world, one region to another, the buoyage is diametrically opposed in meaning, which still strikes me as weird. I can understand cars on different side of the road because you don't tend to go from one region to another in one trip. But in the aviation world, we have aligned the processes around the world so that everywhere you land, the meaning of symbols, etc., is the same. Is there any intent under becoming an intergovernmental organisation to actually bring this last step to get alignment so that buoyage systems mean the same thing, whether a seafarer comes from the United States or from Australia?
Thank you, Senator. At the moment, there is nothing on the work agenda that would opt to change the maritime buoyage system to which you've referred. That system has been in place now for a very long period of time, and the work that IALA is focusing on is increasing the technology that will be able to interface with the ships so that the potential for that kind of not knowing which part of the world, which buoyage system you're working with, will be eased by the fact that there'll be other resources that are available on board the ship to assist with that. But that's not to say that once the organisation becomes an international, an IGO, that the member states can't decide that that really is a matter that governments want to focus on and put that on the agenda moving forward.
Sure. So, two follow-up questions then in terms of obligations on member states and particularly sub-levels of government. So here in Australia, we nationally sign up to these standards regardless of the nature of the body that's setting them. And then state and territory governments are often responsible for local waters and the buoyage. But if the buoyage indicates the presence of a channel and the information that's been provided to cartographers to make hydrographic charts indicate depths of channels, is there any obligation on state governments to then maintain dredging activities such that those channels actually meet the advertised depth? Clearly, large commercial channels tend to get self-dredge if ships go through and drag a bit out. But there are many that affect fishing fleets and recreational fleets where if a local council or a state government feels they don't have sufficient funds this year, dredging doesn't occur, and then you start getting incidents which cost money for the people who damage the boat, but also potentially affects the environment if you have oil leakage or other things from boats that run aground. So are there any flow-down obligations for local authorities, state authorities to actually implement dredging operations so that the buoyage and cartography matches reality?
So, Senator, there's two separate things there, and as you've identified, one is about the channel markers, the buoyage system, the other is about the cartography, the seabed shape, which is mapped by the hydrographers. In terms of AMSA's role with the aids to navigation, there is no power for AMSA to require that states or territories do any of the things that you have identified. Our responsibility is in terms of making sure that passage is safe from a navigational perspective in terms of the aids to navigation that are provided to shipping. The hydrographic survey will change over time, and it's up to the controllers of the waterways to decide what's in their best interest in terms of keeping those shipping channels open.
Sure. But if somebody coming into a harbour uses either the leading marks or leading lights to align themselves in what a chart says and what the physical markers on the ground say is the safe channel, and it's not, then who's actually responsible for that? Is it the vessel captain who's, if there's not a notice to seamen to indicate or notice to mariners to indicate that the channel is not as deep as a chart says? So I'm just concerned because I look, again, from a national security perspective, a ship that blocks a channel going into Adelaide, for example, where there is one location to take off liquid fuels, industry estimates are it would take a number of weeks to actually unload a container vessel that is stuck. We have about 10 days' worth of aviation fuel in Adelaide, so there are actually national security and economic implications to those things not being aligned.
Did you want to take that?
I understand the risk you're raising. We might, obviously states have jurisdiction over their waters. We might need to take on notice exactly how that coordination works and the sorts of actions that states and territories take to ensure alignment between the cartography and what's actually happening on the seabed.
So what I'm getting at is this committee will make a report as to whether we support signing up to the treaty, but during these committee processes, we often uncover issues that are related, and we can make recommendations to government that they should seek to work either through National Cabinet or by regulation to work with states and territories to make sure that we have actually alignment, so the intended outcome, which is safe maritime navigation, which underpins not only safety of life at sea, but our economic and national security interests, are actually met by this.
Absolutely. So we'll come back to you on notice with some information about how that current system operates in terms of ensuring the alignment between the maps and
if there were any regulatory or legislative change
Yep.
that would be required to make sure that those pieces line up that this committee could recommend, then having that back in time for our reporting would be useful.
Thank you, Senator. We'll make sure
my last question, if I can, very quickly. AIS, clearly that's a useful thing in terms of ship position, but it's also used on markers now, a lot of shipping markers, etc. The one variable that causes a lot of angst amongst the maritime community is craypots and fishing net buoys. Increasingly, commercial fishermen opt to use AIS markers on those essentially obstructions that can foul propellers, and we saw HMAS Toowoomba, I think it was, in the South China Sea recently, fouled in a fishing net. So what actions, if anything, is the Australian government looking to take through this treaty arrangement to put in place international standards, which we can then flow down to our subordinate authorities to require AIS marking of significant, kilometre-long nets and large fields of craypots, etc.
Perhaps Ms Dean can talk through. There are sort of 7 areas of standards that IALA currently has. They then have a series of guidelines and other practices that sit beneath that. If there is an issue identified like that, then particularly as a council member, Australia could advocate to put those sorts of things on the work program. That because they're voluntary standards, I would say that doesn't preclude us from taking action where there are risks within our waters, but obviously where we can get international alignment and consistency internationally, then it increases the prospect of, because most vessels visiting our waters are international, we want that international consistency, so it means the same thing in every place that you go to. But if it's not currently covered by the standards, and my understanding is it's not, then that's the sort of thing where, as a council member, Australia could take a role in advocating for those sorts of things to be considered.
So yes, if you can come back with some more information on
Yeah,
that. But your comment just raises a question for me then. You said it's a voluntary standard. If I equate this with ICAO in terms of the civil aviation markings, that is an obligation which a country has to file a difference or an exception to if we're not going to meet it. If this becomes an IGO, will they then become mandatory for signatories and a requirement to lodge exceptions, or does it still remain a completely voluntary system?
No, it remains voluntary at this stage. For it to become mandatory, we would need to make further amendments to this new convention, and we would expect more extensive consultation around that if we were going to make something mandatory rather than voluntary. But one of the advantages of moving to an IGO rather than non-governmental is at the moment there are a number of countries who are constrained in their ability to become members of this organisation and adopt the standards, because as an NGO, their sort of rules or their laws in their country prevent them from becoming members of an NGO. But as they become an IGO, more countries will be able to become members of IALA. They will be able to get access to those standards and to voluntarily adopt them. But certainly in Australia's case, while they're voluntary, AMSA has adopted them across its ATON network. My understanding is the states and territories have as well. I think it's in our interest to have as many members and as much international consistency as we can, but that would be subject to a separate treaty action if we were to move to mandatory standards.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
I might just ask one of this.
Yep, go for it.
Does Australia plan to take part in any of the committees or subsidiary bodies provided for under Article 9?
Yes. We already are participating in all of the committees, so representatives from either AMSA or Australia's industry or ports groups are already able to participate in those committees and actively do so.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask?
We'll go, so we jump across, so we'll go to Bowman first. Member for Bowman.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question in relation to Article 13. It's envisaged that we're going to be paying an annual contribution, and that's going to be the same for each member state. What are we currently paying to the NGO? Is it a similar, is it the same structure, I'm assuming? And what are we anticipating we're going to be paying to the new IGO?
So the current rate is in euros, 18,200. So in Australian dollars, it's about $30,000 is our annual contribution. Under the new structure, we expect it to remain in the same order, given there aren't sort of substantial differences being proposed to sort of the size and shape of the organisation. So our estimate at this stage is it will probably be in the order of around 20,000 euros, so around 33,000 Australian dollars. If that was to change substantially, again, that would be something that goes to the General Council in terms of those sort of substantial decisions.
Thank you. That's less than I anticipated.
Yes. Member for Corangamite has a question.
Thank you for being with us today. My question relates to our role in the Asia Pacific, and how do you think that this IALA's this current discussion and agreement will support our role in the Pacific?
Thanks very much for the question. AMSA already provides significant support to some of our Pacific neighbours. We obviously have a very large body of water that we are responsible for in this part of the world as well. We expect that our ability to work with member states through this new organisation will increase Australia's influence and participation in the uptake of positive improvements into that navigation system through being a member of the Council.
Thank you.
Member for Swan.
Thank you. I understand that the goal of the treaty is to allow for safe and efficient navigation of vessels, and I think Shipping Australia said that they had over 6,000 vessels that made 30,000 port calls, and I think this week we also have like the WA Ports Minister here in Canberra. But from a ground level perspective, what do you think this treaty would mean from like maybe a state or a port perspective, or do you see it as being quite a seamless transition with not much change from someone at the port level?
I expect that on the ground people should not, and we would not expect to see significant change given we're already applying these standards. This is really about Australia being able to help to influence other countries also complying, so that because as you said, there's over 6,000 vessels visiting our waters, 30,000 trips. It's better if they're experiencing the same sort of sets of markers or indicators. It means that we would expect the operations to be safer in our waters because the pilots and the vessel captains are experiencing kind of the same information in each country that they visit. But because we already comply, we wouldn't expect to see any change except for perhaps as there's greater international consistency, people are better at it when they get to our waters.
Right.
Did you want to add to that?
That's correct. And any change we would expect would be future focused. So if new standards come in, we would be looking to both influence how they're developed and then help all Australian ports to apply those as required.
Right. It sounds like you have a question. My question's different, so if yours is on the same chain of thought.
I'd just like to ask a supplementary question, just what you said there. So, you're talking about pilotage and making sure that the experiences were similar. So is it still the practice that all international voyages come in to Australian ports under a pilot program, or has that changed?
Not all ports require pilotage.
Right. So which ports don't require pilotage in Australian waters?
I'd have to take that on notice in terms of where it's very straightforward, you might not require, but something like the Great Barrier Reef, absolutely, there are pilots required given the really sensitive and complex maritime environment. And I possibly misspoke. It wasn't, obviously pilots are another safety feature. They are not part of IALA. But I guess what I was trying to refer to is the ship's crew. Every country they visit, the aids means something different, and it means there's a lot of information to sort of retain and understand. When I'm here, I need to follow the following rules. The greater international consistency we can get, it means that the crews on vessels coming to Australia waters, it's familiar, and so there's less sort of chance of mistake and things can move more efficiently. But no, that was my mistake in terms of the reference to pilots. I apologise.
Okay, thank you.
Member for Swan.
In one of the submissions, I think submission 3, they felt that the International Hydrographic Organisation could take over some of the activities of ILA, and I think one of their quotes was, it should be folded into the extent of IHO. The Australian government should make representations against the establishment of such an organisation as a waste of time, money and bureaucrats that could be put to better use. But you've also contextualised the dollars now, but do you have any comments to that?
Certainly, because they are two quite different things, and I might ask Ms Dean to talk through that, because they're actually referring to two quite separate sort of ways of assisting vessels to navigate.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So the International Hydrographic Organisation is responsible for the standards for survey of the seabed. And Standard 44, which was mentioned in the submission, is the basic rules which are set up by which hydrographers undertake a seabed survey. So beneath the water and not related to the external aids to navigation that IALA has been providing standards for since 1957. So both of those organisations have been running in parallel for a very long time.
Thank you.
Right, okay, well that actually brings us to the end of our questions today. So thank you for your attendance. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcript errors. Please send your responses to questions taken on notice during this hearing to the Secretariat by the 16th of September 2024. I believe there are a couple, so we would welcome those as soon as possible so we can meet the deadline. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Katie.
Yeah, we are now going to go to our next public hearing. We'll wait for our witness to come forward.
During the division, Senator Ford.
Of the seas on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders both past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. In accordance with the committee's resolution of the 4th of August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast and proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's websites. I remind all members of the media for the need for fair and accurate reporting of the proceedings of the committee. I'd like to call our first witness for today's hearing. This is the second hearing that we've held on this treaty. I now welcome Professor Donald Rothwell to give evidence today. Would you please, for the record, state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Professor Donald Rothwell from the ANU College of Law at the Australian National University, where I'm Professor of International Law.
Though the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record questions on notice that are taken. I now would like to invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to members' questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make three preliminary observations. The first is that Australia has been an active participant in the development and negotiation of the law of the sea in the post-World War II era, including at the first and third United Nations conferences on the law of the sea, and most recently during the negotiations leading to the conclusion of the 2024 agreement. The law of the sea is of vital interest to Australia's maritime security, environmental and resource security, and trade security. Second, Australia has a distinctive interest in areas beyond national jurisdiction due to the legal ambiguity associated with the Southern Ocean. While Australia claims the Australian Antarctic Territory and asserts an Australian whale sanctuary offshore the Australian Antarctic Territory in the Southern Ocean, the claim is not recognised. Nevertheless, this agreement does acknowledge that pre-existing regional instruments dealing with areas beyond national jurisdiction will remain in place. As such, Australia should be reassured that the extensive regulation of the Southern Ocean marine environment under the Antarctic Treaty System will remain undisturbed. In that respect, the National Interest Analysis notes the government's intention to lodge an Article 71 declaration highlighting the agreement will act in accordance with regional mechanisms as per Article 5 of the agreement. And then finally, much emphasis is placed on the agreement, such as in Article 17, in promoting the interests of small island developing states and archipelagic states. Other than Australia and New Zealand, the Pacific Islands Forum is principally comprised of small island developing states and archipelagic states. The final communique of the recent August 2024 Pacific Islands Forum meeting reaffirmed the importance of ratification and entry into force of the agreement. If Australia expeditiously ratified the agreement once all domestic treaty processes were completed, this would send a clear message of Australia's support for its regional neighbours who have actively sought to advance the agreement in multilateral fora. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm just going to give a heads up to my committee. I've only really got one question before we jump to other committee members. And I was just hoping that you could expand on your concerns about the agreement's interaction with the Arctic Treaty System. It did come up in our questions that we had last week during our other hearing.
Thank you, Chair. So perhaps the way to think about this is that the Antarctic Treaty and what has become known as the Antarctic Treaty System has since 1959 developed a series of mechanisms for the management, conservation and regulation of the Southern Ocean marine environment. And those mechanisms have been exceptionally successful in terms of regulating the management of fisheries, the protection of the Southern Ocean marine environment, placing a prohibition on mining, for example, in the Southern Ocean. All of those instruments predate this 2024 agreement. So one of the technical treaty issues, if you like, that needed to be resolved with the negotiation of this agreement would how those existing arrangements for the Southern Ocean, how they would remain in place, how they would not be disturbed by the conclusion of the 2024 agreement. That's of particular significance to Australia because, as I observed in my opening remarks, whilst Australia is, of course, the largest claimant to the Antarctic Territory and accordingly has significant interests in the Southern Ocean arising from its territorial interests over the Australian Antarctic Territory, Australia's claim over Antarctica is recognised by just a handful of states. And perhaps the most prominent example of the failure to recognise Australia's claim over Antarctica was, of course, Japan's conduct of whaling in the Southern Ocean in breach of what Australia would have said was the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. So Australia has to straddle seeking to pursue and acknowledge its sovereignty over Antarctica, but also working within the framework of the Antarctic Treaty, Article 4 of which places a limitation and constraint upon how Australia can exercise sovereignty and jurisdiction in Antarctica. So the elegant solution that's been determined in the negotiation of this 2024 agreement are the provisions of Article 5, which recognise that existing legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional and sub-regional bodies will remain in place, and that effectively they will not be impacted upon by the conclusion of this 2024 agreement. And that issue was identified fairly early on during the negotiation of the 2024 agreement because, of course, not only is this an issue that arises in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, but it arises in other parts of the world's oceans where there are pre-existing regional agreements which regulate various aspects of marine biodiversity and fisheries-related activities. So I'm fairly confident that these were issues that were well and truly understood and appreciated during the negotiation of the agreement, and as I observed in my submission to the committee, the national interest analysis acknowledges that the Australian government is well aware of this issue, and it proposes in under Article 71 to make a declaration to that end. Perhaps as a final observation, Chair, it's notable that Chile, which is a state which has ratified the 2024 agreement and which is also a party to the Antarctic Treaty and the associated instruments of the Antarctic Treaty System, Chile has made an Article 71 declaration, and it could be seen as perhaps a possible model for that which Australia might use in terms of the language that Chile has included in its declaration, identifying the significance and the integrity of the Antarctic Treaty System vis-a-vis this agreement.
Thank you. We'll go to the Senator next, who's informed me he does not need to leave for the red bell. It's not green, so we can keep going.
Very good. Thank you. Two questions based on your verbal evidence you've just given us. Firstly, you mentioned mining in the maritime environment. In the Pacific, where we see a difference of opinion, so the Cook Islands, for example, is actually quite upbeat about the economic potential of seabed mining versus Palau and perhaps the broader network who see that it has the potential to be quite destructive. what would be the implication of the changes envisaged here on the ability of those nations to determine what they believe is best for their national interest?
Thank you. So I think to that end, it's once again important to understand the interaction of these various treaty regimes. And the starting point is that this agreement doesn't seek to disturb the core provisions that exist under the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And it seeks to complement those provisions, but it also seeks to fill gaps where the 1982 Convention doesn't address certain issues. So with respect to the issue of deep seabed mining, which is by definition mining that occurs beyond national jurisdiction, which is consistent with how that is interpreted under this agreement. Deep seabed mining is, of course, I have a prop, regulated under this convention, the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, with the International Seabed Authority being the relevant regulatory body established under Part 11 of the Convention. So the mandate of the International Seabed Authority is not really disturbed at all by the application of this 2024 agreement, and so any provisions which permit deep seabed mining to occur consistently with the Law of the Sea Convention will occur consistently with the framework, the foundational convention, the 1982 Convention, rather than this 2024 agreement.
Sure. So, in what ways then will this 2024 agreement seek to address some of the concerns that are raised by nations like Australia, which manage our fish stocks well? But if you look on some of the apps that are available now that show maritime traffic around the world through AIS, you see literally running down the EEZ boundary, particularly of South America, large numbers, swarms of fishing boats who are just either waiting to go dark and duck inside or waiting for the fish who don't recognise the boundary to stray outside those boundaries so that they can plunder that fish stock. Are any of those sort of things which have caused concern over the past decade or more going to be addressed by these changes?
So to that end, it needs to be recalled that the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea provides for the freedom of high seas fishing, but that has been further regulated under the provisions of the 1995 Agreement on the implementation of the provisions of the Convention relating to the conservation and management of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks, which is commonly known as the Fish Stocks Agreement. So the Fish Stocks Agreement deals with straddling and highly migratory species that will sit just outside the Australian Exclusive Economic Zone, or species that will move from the Australian Exclusive Economic Zone into the high seas. So there's already in place an instrument which deals with some of those issues, but it's not completely comprehensive. And in answer to your question, one of the potential outcomes of the operation of this 2024 agreement is the development of much more robust high seas fisheries frameworks, which would be to the advantage of Australia. Now, that also needs to be overseen in terms of the existence of what are already called regional fisheries management organisations. So there are already some frameworks in place, but this will provide a much more robust, more comprehensive framework for the management of high seas fisheries and address some of the concerns that you've raised.
Unfortunately, we have to suspend there. I'm just going to, and thank you for your attendance here today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and we'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcript errors. Please send your correspondence to any questions on notice during this hearing to the Secretariat by the close of business, 16th September 2024. I would like to thank members and witnesses for their time and now declare this public hearing closed. An apology.